In front of hundreds of guests, a billionaire smirked and pointed to the grand piano. "If you can play this, I'll marry you," she laughed. The room erupted in laughter, but when the black janitor sat down, what happened next left everyone frozen in shock. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The room glittered beneath the soft glow of golden chandeliers, each crystal prism catching the light like tiny stars. Waiters in white gloves moved elegantly through the crowd, balancing silver trays of champagne flutes. The air was thick with the scent of roses, perfume, and expensive cigars. A string quartet played softly in the background, their music blending seamlessly with the gentle hum of aristocratic laughter. At the heart of the ballroom, Vanessa Kingsley stood like a queen surveying her court. The billionaire heiress was wrapped in a deep emerald gown that shimmered every time she moved. Her diamond necklace caught the light like a weapon, sharp and dazzling. She held a champagne glass delicately between manicured fingers, her every gesture polished to perfection. Around her, a circle of admirers laughed at her witty remarks, desperate to stay in her favor. That was when her eyes landed on Jamal. He was standing near the far wall, just inside the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. His uniform was plain, a crisp white shirt rolled to the elbows, a black apron, and those bright yellow cleaning gloves that seemed almost absurd in such an opulent setting. In his hands, he clutched a mop handle like a soldier's spear, patiently waiting for the party to wind down so he could begin his shift. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her smile curving into something sharper. She took a slow sip of champagne, her gaze never leaving him. The conversations around her faltered as her friends followed her stare. "You there?" she called, her voice dripping with curiosity and just enough volume to cut through the music. "What's your name?" Jamal hesitated for only a second, feeling dozens of eyes snap toward him. "Jamal," he replied softly, his voice calm but steady. Vanessa's smirk deepened. She turned slightly, gesturing with her champagne glass toward the sleek black grand piano positioned at the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting the glittering lights above. "If you can play that piano," she paused, her words stretching like a cat toying with prey, "I'll marry you." The crowd gasped, then burst into varying degrees of amusement, chuckles, snickers, even outright laughter. To them, it was obvious this was one of Vanessa's little games, another way to assert her superiority in front of an eager audience. The idea that a janitor could match her in any meaningful way was ridiculous to them. One man in a tailored tuxedo leaned toward his companion and whispered, "This should be good." Another guest, a woman dripping in pearls, fanned herself and murmured, "Poor man, he's about to embarrass himself." But Jamal didn't laugh. He didn't fidget or look away. He simply raised one eyebrow, as though the words had landed on him and slid right off. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk toward the piano. The crowd's laughter softened into curious murmurs. Each step echoed faintly against the marble floor. The musicians stopped playing, their bows hanging midair. Vanessa's smile froze in place, as if she hadn't entirely expected him to take up the challenge. Jamal reached the piano, pausing to remove his gloves with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place in this glittering hall. He folded them neatly, placing them on the polished surface as though they, too, deserved respect. Then, he pulled out the piano bench and sat down. For a long moment, he didn't move. His fingers hovered above the keys. His gaze focused not on the crowd, but on the instrument itself, as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. The room was so silent that the faint ticking of a distant clock could be heard. Vanessa crossed her arms, her tone playful but laced with challenge. "Any day now, Mr. Janitor." Jamal's lips curved into the faintest hint of smile. Then his fingers descended. The first note rang out pure and strong, slicing through the silence like sunlight breaking into a dark room. His hands moved with a fluid grace, each chord flowing effortlessly into the next. The melody swelled, rich and intricate, filling every corner of the grand hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People who had been smirking moments ago now stood frozen, their eyes wide, their champagne glasses forgotten. He played with a depth that spoke of years of passion and discipline, his music weaving between joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. Every rise and fall of the notes seemed to tell a story, his story, though no one in the room knew it yet. Vanessa's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The arrogance in her gaze wavered, replaced by something more complicated, something dangerously close to admiration. By the time the final note faded into the air, the room was utterly still. Jamal sat down at the piano, the polished wood gleaming under the chandelier's light. His yellow cleaning gloves, a sharp contrast against the black and white keys, were still on. This only fueled the whispers that had already begun swirling around the ballroom. "Does he even know how to read music?" one man muttered, leaning toward his date. "He probably thinks the piano is just for decoration." Another chuckled, swirling his champagne. Vanessa stood a few feet away, arms folded neatly across her chest, her smirk unwavering. She'd seen this before, people stepping into a spotlight they weren't ready for, and she relished the moment when their confidence would crumble. What no one in that glittering room knew was that this wasn't Jamal's first time sitting at a piano. Years ago, in a cramped apartment on the corner of Briar Street, an old upright piano had sat tucked into his grandmother's living room. The wood was scratched, the paint chipped, and several keys stuck if you pressed them too hard. But to young Jamal, it was magic. While the streets outside were filled with shouting, sirens, and the daily chaos of a neighborhood struggling to survive, the piano was his sanctuary. He'd spend hours after school pressing each key, memorizing the way it sang back to him. At first, he tried copying jingles from the radio. Then he moved on to the soulful jazz records his grandmother loved, Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, and Nina Simone. He learned everything by ear, feeling the music in his fingertips before he even knew the names of the chords. Over time, he began to compose his own melodies, weaving his emotions into sound. That piano was where he dreamed, where he felt safe. But when his grandmother passed away, the instrument was sold to pay the bills. Jamal hadn't touched a piano in years, not until now. The ballroom's air was thick with expectation and quiet mockery. Jamal flexed his fingers over the keys, still gloved. The gloves made it harder to feel the texture of the ivory beneath his touch, but he didn't remove them. He wanted them to see exactly who was playing, the janitor they had dismissed before he played a single note. He closed his eyes, and then the first chord rang out, low and rich, filling the room with a sound so unexpected that several guests straightened in surprise. His hands moved again, this time dancing across the keys in a cascading melody. The notes flowed like water, smooth and unbroken, rising and falling with effortless grace. The crowd, moments ago buzzing with gossip, went silent. The music shifted into something deeper, a blend of blues and classical, heartbreak and hope. Each note carried a piece of his past, every chord a memory, the smell of his grandmother's cooking in the next room, the sound of rain against the apartment windows, the way music drowned out the shouting on the street below. Vanessa's smirk faltered. She tilted her head, studying him more closely. This was not the fumbling performance that she'd expected. This was mastery. One of the older guests, a man with silver hair and a history in the arts, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "That's Chopin, but with a jazz influence." Remarkable. The piece swelled, building into a crescendo so powerful that it seemed to vibrate in the very floor beneath their feet. Jamal's gloved hands moved with a precision and passion that no amount of wealth or training could fake. Some guests blinked rapidly, fighting the unexpected sting of tears. Others simply stared transfixed. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music softened, drifting into a gentle, lingering finish. The final note hung in the air, trembling before fading into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandeliers seemed to glow a little brighter in the stillness. Then came a sound, not of laughter or ridicule, but of applause. Hesitant at first, then growing into thunderous clapping that filled the entire hall. Several people even stood, moved by what they had just witnessed. Vanessa didn't clap right away. Her arms had lowered, her expression unreadable. She took a slow breath, her eyes locked on Jamal. Jamal stood, picking up his yellow gloves from where they rested against the piano's edge. He didn't bow, didn't smile for their approval. He simply turned to face the crowd, a man who had just reminded an entire room that greatness can come from anywhere. And in that moment, Vanessa Kingsley, for the first time that evening, had nothing clever to say. Then, Jamal's fingers began to dance across the keys. At first, the sound was soft, almost fragile, like the faint rustle of leaves on a quiet afternoon. Each note floated through the ballroom like a whisper, delicate yet intentional. Conversations stumbled to a halt mid-sentence. Laughter died down. The clinking of champagne glasses faded into stillness. Those closest to the piano turned first, their expressions shifting from polite disinterest to cautious curiosity. A couple near the back craned their necks to see who was playing. The melody curled gently through the air, warm and inviting. There was no rush in his playing. Every note landed exactly where it was meant to be, as if the music had been written into the very fabric of the room. And then, without warning, the music swelled. It wasn't just louder, it came alive. The delicate whispers grew into a voice full of color and complexity. Classical elegance wrapped itself around the deep, sultry rhythms of jazz, and together they painted something entirely new. Jamal's left hand laid down a steady, rich foundation, while his right hand wove intricate patterns of melody above it, shimmering like light on water. This wasn't performance for applause. This was storytelling. Every phrase carried weight. Moments of joy bursting like sunlight breaking through clouds, passages of sorrow that pressed heavy on the heart, and strands of hope threaded through it all, rising again and again no matter how deep the shadows fell. It was as though the keys were an extension of his soul, and he was letting the room hear everything he'd never said out loud. Several guests, drawn in despite themselves, closed their eyes. One woman with a diamond bracelet found herself swaying gently in time with the rhythm, forgetting to sip her drink. A man in a sharp tuxedo lowered his phone, realizing that to record it would be to miss it. Others simply stared, caught between disbelief and awe. How could a man they had dismissed, the janitor in yellow gloves, command such power over the room? Near the back, a man who had once trained at the conservatory leaned toward his companion. "He's improvising over a classical progression," he whispered. "You can't fake that kind of instinct. You either have it or you don't." Vanessa stood in the center, her arms still folded, but the smirk that had been plastered on her face since the challenge had dissolved. The longer she listened, the less certain she felt about her own little game. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had expected clumsy notes, an awkward laugh, maybe an embarrassed retreat, the kind of harmless humiliation that would amuse her friends for weeks. Instead, she was hearing something that silenced not just the crowd, but the voice in her own mind that always seemed to have a clever comment ready. The music shifted again, faster now, playful, almost teasing. It was as if the piano itself had decided to dance. Jamal's fingers blurred, his hands moving in a seamless blur of motion that made even the most skilled pianists in the room exchange wide-eyed glances. And then, like a master storyteller approaching the final chapter, he slowed. The rapid fire of notes softened into a tender melody, the kind that makes you lean in so you won't miss a single moment. A single high note rang out, pure and clean, and hung in the air. His left hand responded with a low, steady chord, the musical equivalent of a promise kept. The piece was ending. The last few measures were played with such care that it felt almost like a goodbye, not just to the song, but to the moment they'd all shared without realizing it. The final note trembled in the air, suspended, and then faded into silence. For several seconds, the ballroom was utterly still. It was as though everyone was afraid to be the first to break whatever spell had been cast. The chandeliers gleamed overhead, their light catching the faintest glisten of moisture in more than one pair of eyes. And then, slowly, the sound of applause began, a few hesitant claps from the back, followed by a ripple of others joining in. Within moments, the room was alive again, but this time with something different. Not arrogance, not dismissal, but genuine admiration. Some guests even rose to their feet, giving him a standing ovation. Vanessa didn't move at first. Her gaze stayed locked on Jamal, searching for something. Perhaps an explanation, perhaps a weakness, perhaps just a way to reconcile the man she'd mocked with the artist who had just stolen the entire evening. Jamal didn't bow. He didn't smile or soak in the applause. Instead, he simply removed his yellow gloves, one finger at a time, placed them gently on the piano lid, and stood. With quiet dignity, he stepped away from the instrument, his posture calm, his eyes steady. And in that moment, the unspoken truth settled over the room like a weight. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people are the ones you never see coming. When the final note faded into the air, there was a moment of pure, unbroken silence, the kind of pause that comes when a room full of people forgets to breathe. Then it happened. Applause erupted, rolling through the ballroom like a wave. It began with a few claps from the back, then swelled into a thunderous ovation. Some guests stood to their feet, cheering. Others whistled. The echo of their praise bounced off the marble walls and glittering chandeliers. Jamal rose from the piano bench, his movements calm and deliberate. He slipped off his bright yellow gloves, one finger at a time, and placed them neatly on the glossy black lid of the grand piano. He didn't bow. He didn't flash a humble smile. Instead, he turned toward Vanessa Kingsley, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Marry you," he said, his voice carrying easily over the applause. "No thanks. I already know my worth." The clapping faltered for just a moment as his words sank in. Then came the collective gasp, sharp and audible like the sound of glass shattering. Vanessa's perfectly composed face turned crimson. It wasn't the flush of rage people expected, but the hot sting of embarrassment. Shame. In that instant, every eye in the room turned from her to him, and she knew she'd been the one exposed. She had tried to make him the punchline, but now she was the joke. Not because she'd been rejected, but because she'd underestimated someone so completely. Her champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand. For the first time that night, Vanessa found herself at a loss for words. From the far side of the room, an older gentleman in a tailored suit stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. He moved with quiet authority, the kind of presence that didn't need to be announced. "I'm the director of the City Symphony," he said, extending a business card toward Jamal. His voice was warm, respectful. "We could use talent like yours. In fact, I think the city needs to hear you." Jamal accepted the card with a small nod. "Thank you, sir." Before he could take another step, a woman in a sapphire gown approached, her eyes bright with excitement. "I sponsor young musicians," she said quickly. "If you ever want to record an album, I'll cover the costs. Your music deserves the world stage." More guests began to close in. Reporters, patrons of the arts, wealthy investors who just moments ago hadn't even noticed him standing in the corner. In minutes, Jamal went from the janitor to the man everyone wanted to talk to. Someone handed him a glass of champagne. Another asked for a photograph. Conversations shifted from gossip about Vanessa's parties to questions about Jamal's influences, his training, his future. Jamal answered each question with quiet dignity, never letting the attention make him smaller, and never letting it swell him into something he wasn't. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood rooted to the spot, the hum of conversation and camera flashes swirling around her like a storm she couldn't control. Her friends, the same ones who had laughed at Jamal minutes before, were now looking at her with something that wasn't quite admiration anymore. Finally, she stepped forward. "Jamal," she began, her voice softer than before. But Jamal didn't let her finish. He met her gaze with the same calm steadiness as before. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just remember tonight. Remember that talent, dignity, and worth don't come with a price tag." Her lips parted as though to speak again, but she closed them. She nodded just once and stepped back. The party didn't end that night because the champagne ran out or the band packed up. It ended because the focus had shifted entirely. The room wasn't Vanessa's kingdom anymore. It belonged to Jamal, not because of wealth, but because of respect. As the guests began to leave, several stopped to shake his hand, to thank him for the performance, to promise introductions and opportunities. The older gentleman from the symphony lingered at the door, giving Jamal one last nod of approval before disappearing into the night. When the crowd thinned, Jamal returned to the piano for a moment. He touched the keys lightly, letting his fingers rest there, not to play, but to remember. He thought of his grandmother, of the old upright piano in her living room, of the lessons learned in the quiet hours when no one was watching. He smiled to himself, a private smile no one else would see, and walked away. The yellow gloves were still sitting on the piano lid. He didn't take them, because tonight, everyone in that room would remember exactly who they belonged to. Weeks later, the world looked very different for Jamal. The packed theater buzzed with anticipation, a low hum of conversation and excitement filling the air. Every seat was taken from the plush red chairs in the front row to the highest balcony at the back. Cameramen jostled for position, adjusting lenses, testing angles, ready to capture every second of his first public concert. The stage lights bathed the grand piano in a warm golden glow. Its polished surface reflected the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers above. In the shadows backstage, Jamal stood still for a moment, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He could hear the audience settling, the rustle of programs, the faint squeak of shoes on the polished floor. Somewhere in the crowd, a child whispered to their parent, "That's him, right? The janitor from a story." The story. It had spread faster than he ever imagined. Clips of that night in the ballroom, shaky phone footage of him sitting at the piano in yellow gloves, had gone viral. The world had fallen in love with not just his music, but the truth behind it. That talent can live anywhere, even in places people rarely look. When the stage manager gave the signal, Jamal walked out into the light. The applause hit him like a wave, crashing forward, loud and unrelenting. He smiled faintly, not at the fame, but at the knowledge that every cheer was for his music, for the story it told. And then, in the very back row of the theater, he saw her, Vanessa Kingsley. She was dressed simply tonight, without the glittering jewelry or entourage that usually trailed her. Her hair was loose, her expression calm. She wasn't here to judge. She wasn't here to mock. She was here to listen. Jamal gave no sign that he had noticed her, but in the quiet space between applause and the first note, their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. She nodded, not as a challenge this time, but as a quiet acknowledgement. He sat down at the piano. The same piano piece from that unforgettable night in the ballroom was waiting beneath his fingertips. The first notes rose gently into the theater, soft and pure, floating across the room like a promise kept. The melody built slowly, each phrase unfolding with deliberate care, carrying the same mix of classical precision and soulful improvisation that had captivated the ballroom weeks ago. But tonight, it felt different. In the ballroom, his music had been a defense, a shield against humiliation. Tonight, it was an offering. It was gratitude for his grandmother, for every hard day that had taught him discipline, for every person who had believed in him after hearing his story. It was proof that sometimes life gives you the microphone when you least expect it, and you have to be ready to sing. As the piece swelled into its more complex passages, the audience leaned forward, caught in the gravity of the performance. Some swayed gently. Others closed their eyes to better feel the rhythm and emotion flowing from the stage. In the back row, Vanessa listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She remembered every smirk, every word she had spoken that night, and how quickly her certainty had crumbled the moment he touched the keys. She had been wrong, deeply, undeniably wrong. And now she was here, not to rewrite the past, but to respect the man she had once dismissed. When the final note landed, the theater exploded into a standing ovation. The sound filled the air, echoing against the walls, vibrating through the wooden stage. Jamal stood, bowed once, and accepted the applause with a quiet grace. But when the journalists rushed forward after the performance, asking about the airs from the ballroom, he didn't take the bait. He never spoke badly about Vanessa. Instead, he said the same thing he had repeated in every interview since that night. Never judge someone's talent by their uniform. Greatness has no dress code. It wasn't a jab. It wasn't a grudge. It was a truth he had lived and earned the right to share. Vanessa, still seated in the back row, closed her eyes for a moment and let the words sink in. She didn't leave right away when the crowd began to file out. She stayed seated, listening to the faint echoes of the piano in her mind. That night, as the lights dimmed and the theater emptied, one thing became clear. The insult she had intended had transformed into something far greater. It had become an opportunity. And Jamal's music, born from a dusty old piano in a small apartment, had changed the way an entire room, and perhaps an entire city, saw the world. Somewhere his grandmother would have been proud. And Jamal? He didn't need to win over every person who had ever doubted him. He only needed to keep playing. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget, true talent can come from anywhere, and respect should be given to everyone. Hit that like button, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and remember, never underestimate someone just because of where they stand today. Tomorrow, they might just change the world.